This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 54. With me, as always, is Depth Mystic Zach Tollen. Hello, hello. And today, the first thing we're going to cover is this new concept that you have of the Taoist idea of Yin and Yang. And I think we've gone over it before, but I think we haven't fully emphasized just how novel your way of defining Yin and Yang actually are. Yeah, that's true. I was talking to some friends, and I started using Yin and Yang in the way that I understand it, which has a sort of clear definition. It's not a kind of a murky definition that we have to intuit from ancient Chinese Taoism. I've adopted the terminology and identified what I believe it actually is underneath functionally, but I found my way to a degree of clarity that has to be distinguished from existing definitions of Yin and Yang. Okay, well, tell me what they are. Well, before I go on, I just want to say, we were kind of debating what kind of Taoism this is, if it's not ancient Taoism. If I'm adding a new, fresh definition to these terms, we might need a better adjective. And I've sometimes called it Neo-Taoism because it's like new Taoism. But that term actually has some history in ancient scholarship. So in the most extreme case, in order to be precise, we're calling this Zach-Tolenian Taoism. Taoism according to Zach-Tollen. And that way we don't have to worry about being in the wrong category if we go to that extreme. But I would like to think that if other people just think on what I'm saying, they would come to a similar conclusion, and maybe this type of Taoism would acquire a name that wasn't simply attached to the name of the person who thought of it. That's a pretty elaborate preface. I guess you're being rather conscientious about not wanting to be perceived as claiming something you're not claiming. Yeah, I'm not always that picky with my ideas, but I know there's a lot of people who really are rather picky with their ideas. And if somebody who's studied Taoism their whole life hears me using these terms, I just want to make sure we're in the clear. Okay, well, we're in the clear. So go on about how you see the terms Yin and Yang. Let's start with Yin. Yin is what we call reality. If you take everything that is in what we call reality, that's what I call Yin. And traditionally, it's associated with the earth. And that makes sense. I mean, the earth is reality. When people say, I think you should come down to earth, they mean precisely, you're too caught up in your fantasies, and you should come closer to reality. This is also what I call philosophical femininity. And I distinguish it from biological femininity. What we know of as actual human females is one thing. But philosophically, the feminine is a whole other thing. And we need to learn to make this distinction. Okay, that sounds like a pretty good start. But how is it possible to even know what's in reality? Well, we have the part of reality that we are conscious of, which is, generally speaking, a much smaller part, and the part of reality that is reality regardless of whether we're conscious of it or not. In other words, most of reality we're not conscious of at any given time. And a lot of reality we're never conscious of. But nonetheless, that is what I call Yin. And so when you're dealing with Yin, the real question is, are you aware of it? Or is it just some aspect of reality that the consciousness in question is not aware of? This includes the material world. It also includes the way people are. Like if there's a certain truth about a group of people or a specific person or human nature in general, then knowing that truth is knowing something about reality, because people really are this way or they have these tendencies. When you talk about book smarts versus street smarts, Yin tends to be about street smarts. But, it could also be about book smarts, especially if the books you read were telling you true things about the world. It's the realm of facts, and it's commonly associated with physical matter. And I should point out that the Christian movement, in the first couple hundred years of the Christian movement, and even to this day, Christianity tries to point itself away from matter. It says that the prince of this world is the devil. And so the tendency here is to cast matter as evil, which is to say to cast reality as evil. Yin, philosophical femininity. I should also add it's associated with darkness because it tends to be connected with unconsciousness. Like reality is always there, and generally speaking, we're not conscious of all of it. We're only conscious of a small amount. And so any basic understanding of reality makes us realize that just because something is shrouded in darkness doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay, that seems like a pretty good survey. But again, how does anybody even know reality? How do you know that you know reality? Well, a lot of people, they have experiences of being deceived, of being caught up in something they previously thought was true and then realizing it wasn't true. And then they wonder, how do I know if anything's true? Maybe nothing's true. Maybe everything's an illusion. But I think the people who want everything to be an illusion are succumbing to a kind of temptation. As I said, you see it start in the beginning of the Christian movement, which is to get away from this world. This world is the devil. And so a lot of people want to get away from reality. And so occasionally they'll conclude it's all just a big illusion. But I guess you just have to have some confidence that some aspect of your experience is corresponding with the way the world actually is. And everybody operates this way, whether or not they feel comfortable in the abstract sense about whether they are connected with reality. But certainly from a functional point of view, everybody operates to some degree in reality. Your body is reality, and you are connected to your body. But maybe we should get onto Yang now that I'm starting to talk about being connected with the body, because that starts to have a bit of Yang in there. But one more thing, Yin is nature. All of nature is Yin. Everything in nature. Let's move on to Yang, because if Yin includes everything in reality, then it doesn't seem like there's much left for Yang to do, does it? So, in my world, Yang is human ideas about how reality could be different from what it is. Like human beings have this capacity to conceptualize what they want and what they have to do in order to change the world to become what they're looking for. So Yang is human intention. You're saying Yang doesn't even exist if it's not in human beings? Generally speaking, yes, I am. Because nature, Mother Nature is associated with Mother Feminine. Feminine is associated with the philosophical feminine, which is what I call Yin. So if we look at nature, even the most masculine aspects of regular nature without humanity, there's still something Yin about it. Just, it is the way it is. There's no implicit value judgment that applies to it. So even two lions, they're fighting ferociously for dominance in the savannah. We can still perceive it as just nature fighting nature. And so when I talk about Yang, by and large, I am just talking about this world that human beings live in. To get a rudimentary understanding of this world, I can use the myth of the Garden of Eden. Basically, Adam and Eve are happy in paradise. They're unconscious. They have not eaten from the tree. But then when they do eat from the tree, they have a violent disruption because the world of nature as they once knew it is now subjected to these kind of value judgments. It's like, why does this have to be that way? Why is it bad? And so yang is these value judgments. Yang is this conceptualization of how the world can be different. And for me, the point of the story of the Garden of Eden is that human beings are a special animal. Aristotle called us the rational animal. And the mythology in the garden is that they become like God. When people eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then they become like God, and now they know the difference between good and evil. And from my perspective, that means now you have concepts about the world, about how the world could be different from how it is. And you have the urge to enact those concepts. You feel bad when the world is worse than it could be. Now, obviously, every person has a different yang, a different idea of how the world ought to be better. My yang is that I win all my battles, all my fights. I accomplish everything that I want to accomplish. And my opponent's yang is that he wins those battles. Now, yang in traditional Chinese philosophy is associated with heaven. And this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because heaven is like an amalgamation of all your yang, all of your ideas of how things ought to be, consolidated into one dreamlike concept that we call heaven. But on earth, you can only enact little tiny heavens. So if you want to eat ice cream, then you can go to the store and buy the ice cream, assuming you have the funds to do it. And so in real life, yang is constantly thwarted by yin. It's constantly thwarted by the reality that we're actually facing. But we're special. And the myth of the Garden of Eden illustrates the conflict that happens once human beings acquire yang. Once we acquire ideas of the difference between better and worse, or good and evil, the knowledge of how things could be better haunts us perpetually. And certainly for people who are highly religious and buy into the biblical narrative with full force, they are even more haunted by it, because the biblical narrative is pretty stark. But I will point out that the way the biblical narrative is constructed is that God is the creator of the universe. In other words, in that story, God already has yang. God already has an idea about how the universe could be different and the ability to apply his powers to change it so that it becomes the way he wants it to become. Now, I think there's a strong argument that that is a psychological projection, that all human beings are born with some amount of yang, or they develop rather quickly some amount of ideas. And when we say the creator, when we talk about a creator, generally speaking, we're talking about an artist or an architect. We're talking about a human being who envisions something and creates it, because there's nothing else in nature that creates. There's nothing else in nature that is creative the way human beings are creative. And so in the Bible, it appears that that is projected onto God himself, that the universe itself, reality itself, is ruled over and is made up of this God that has this yang. And then he creates humans, and he tries to prevent them from becoming like him. But an empirical observation of reality that is accessible to us, in my opinion, it yields the result that human beings themselves are the only real creators. We're the only ones who can take a piece of clay and mold it into a shape that we want to mold it into. Maybe other animals do some extremely rudimentary version of that, but human beings have this conceptual apparatus. It's like a psychological ability that is related to what's going on in our brain that allows us to conceptualize things. And so in a way, instead of us becoming like God, it does seem like this is an example of we made God in our image. We made God a creator. When we look at a bunch of sticks, we see the potential for a boat. when we look at the material world, we see the potential that it can be manipulated and turned into something else that we create. And the monotheistic tradition projects that characteristic onto God and then says when we eat of the apple, we become like God. And they can't really imagine a world that wasn't created consciously by a kind of yang. They don't seem to be able to imagine a world with no intelligent design that was sort of just here, and there was no consciousness that created it. So there's a very strong projection, assuming that that's what actually happened, assuming that there is no yang outside of human beings like I'm talking about it. But what I am saying is that visibly, from what we can actually see, there is no yang other than what people have, in the sense that we have ideas of how things can be created, and we apply those ideas and create those things. The rest of nature, if you believe in intelligent design, then it was created a very long time ago in a mysterious way. And a lot of people believe that because they don't think nature could have just showed up accidentally. But we certainly don't observe it. We observe nature continuing itself. We don't really observe nature creating itself. So all the yang that I see in the world is basically in the human psyche. And I think that the myth of the Garden of Eden, of the fall from paradise, once we acquired yang, in other words, we were natural creatures. We were just animals like bonobos or chimpanzees or something. And then something happened in our brains, and then we acquired this ability to conceptualize how the world could be different from how it is. And that caused a huge disruption. All of a sudden, that conceptualization is at odds with how things are. How things are just going their own way, but now they seem like dark and deprived. They seem like it's a fallen world as a result. But that could just be a natural description of the human animal, the particular nature of human beings, that we have that characteristic. We have this yang. All right. Yeah, I hope the audience can handle that rather long-winded, extensive commentary. What about the fact that yang is white, like in the yin and yang symbol? Well, I mean, whiteness is heaven. White is what we wish the world would be. It's in the realm of consciousness. All of yang is kind of conscious. Everything we want the world to be is accessible to our consciousness. The only question is it possible? Which part of our yang is possible? The question with yin is, what part of it is conscious and what part of it is unconscious? What part of reality do we know about and what part don't we know about? And the question with yang is, what part of what we want is actually possible and what part is just what we want, but there's no way to make it happen? That's kind of cool. I mean, you did some pretty elaborate comparative mythology there. I mean, you took the Chinese yin-yang symbol and you found a parallel for it in the Garden of Eden. That'll be enough for people to chew on, hopefully. Although I feel like this topic can't possibly have been completely exhausted. No, it's not even close, because to exhaust yin or philosophical femininity, you'd have to know as much as humanly possible about reality. And that's like a lifelong process of learning about reality. And the effectiveness of your yang can only be based on your sense of yin, your sense of the nature of reality. And what things should be like is its own topic, like ethics, philosophy, the way things ought to be, what laws should be passed. All of this is yang. So even if you have a pretty good sense of the yin, you still need to learn about how things ought to be and come to your conclusions about it. And so yang takes forever to develop too. These are both long-term, endless places of development for people. Okay, that will do it for episode 54. Go to our media and leave a comment, and we will see you next week.